Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson's Side. Happy Monday. Knowing what we know about our current leadership class, the one thing we can be absolutely certain of is they always go too far. They always get over their skis. They just can't help themselves. That's who they are. So in February, when the Russian military invaded Ukraine, there was always out there the chance that the Biden administration would find a way to turn what was a regional tragedy into something bigger, like an historical global catastrophe. That was always possible. So even before Russian forces entered the Ukraine, the White House promised us that would not happen. Quote, there is no intention or interest or desire by the president to send troops to Ukraine. That was the word from Biden's publicist from the White House. She said the very same thing almost identically the next month. The month after that, she said it again. Quote, Joe Biden does not have the intention of sending U.S. troops to Ukraine, Jen Psaki solemnly pledged to the nation. Why did Jen Psaki keep saying the same thing over and over? Well, because it wasn't true. She had to repeat it because it was a lie. That's how lying works. It's not believable, so you have to say it again and again and again. If you want to know if someone's lying, count the times they assert something. The more often they assert it, the less likely it is to be true. But ultimately, the truth does come out. And this weekend, it began to. Joe Biden's top surrogate in the Congress, that would be Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, a former Biden intern, appeared on CBS News and said the opposite of what the White House has been telling us for months. Coons demanded that the Pentagon deploy American troops to Ukraine to fight Russian soldiers. Watch.
In some public remarks this week, you said the country needs to talk about when it might be willing to send troops to Ukraine.
If Vladimir Putin, who has shown us how brutal he can be, is allowed to just continue to massacre civilians, to commit war crimes throughout Ukraine without NATO, without the West coming more forcefully to his aid, I deeply worry that what's going to happen next is that we will see Ukraine turn into Syria. Mm-hmm. The American people cannot turn away from this tragedy in Ukraine. I think the history of the 21st century turns on how fiercely we defend freedom in Ukraine, and that Putin will only stop when we stop him.
Without the West coming more forcefully to the aid of Ukraine. So the Ukrainian military has been trained by NATO. It uses American arms. In some cases, being led by Americans. The Ukrainian government is advised directly moment to moment by Americans. There are many Americans in Ukraine right now doing that. So what Chris Coons is calling for is land war with Russia. Now, that's not a small thing, given that, once again, Chris Coons is Joe Biden's closest ally in the Senate. Chris Coons is an unfailing and faithful spokesman for the administration's policies, whatever those policies happen to be. So when Chris Coons calls for war with Russia, he does not do it accidentally. And in this case, the White House has not distanced itself from what Chris Coons said. Oh, why? Well, because war with Russia is the administration's actual policy. Leaders of the Democratic Party want to topple the Russian government by force and effect regime change in Russia. They have wanted this since the day that Hillary Clinton lost the 2016 presidential race. We know this because they've said so many, many times. And the only reason the rest of us missed it is because we didn't take them seriously enough. But we should have. A hot war with Vladimir Putin using American troops is the logical, maybe inevitable end stage of Russiagate. So the whole thing began with Hillary Clinton complaining, then the P-tape, and now it's moving toward nuclear war. So what would that look like, a hot war with Russia? How many Americans would die during that war? How likely is it to escalate to nuclear conflict? And if we succeed, if we remove Vladimir Putin from office, who will replace him as the head of Russia in charge of 6,000 nuclear weapons? Those are some of the first questions that jump to mind when war with Russia is discussed. But the newsreader on CBS, who was interviewing Chris Coons, didn't bother to ask any of those questions. Nor did she ask the one thing you would need to know if you were running a functioning democracy, which is how many Americans, how many voters actually want war with Russia? What percentage of the American population believes that Ukraine's borders are worth dying for? That's a central question in a democracy, and as it happens, we know the answer, because CBS itself ran a poll on that topic just a week ago, and they asked this question: should the United States send troops to Ukraine? Answer: fully 75% of Americans said no, the United States should not send troops to Ukraine. And yet somehow the CBS newsreader forgot to mention any of this to Chris Coons. Why? Well, you know why. Because in Washington, what you think is irrelevant. Our foreign policy matters of life and death, decisions that destroy nations, are made entirely by people with no skin in the game, people who face no conceivable risk of injury, people like John Bolton and Max Boot, Toria Nuland. Your opinion doesn't factor into the equation at any point. So if you bothered to ask American citizens what they think, and if you cared about democracy you would, they'd likely tell you that their borders are more important to them than Ukraine's borders are. That makes sense because they're Americans, not Ukrainians. And if you ask deeper, you would find out that at the very top of their concerns is not Ukraine. They feel sympathy for the people of Ukraine, but they're not taking up too much disk space brooding about Ukraine moment to moment because they have other things to worry about, starting with their own economy, especially the cost of food, energy, and housing. They're worried about these things, and they're right to be worried. At this point, the United States is looking at a grim economic picture.
Olá pessoal, tudo bem? Aqui é o Tradutor. Eu tô passando para te avisar que eu tô numa campanha para conseguir pelo menos mais 9 apoiadores. Esse canal não é monetizado, então totalmente depende de você. Eu preciso muito do seu apoio para manter esse canal atualizado e vivo, né, no ar. Os links para apoiar esse nosso projeto estão na descrição desse vídeo e no comentário fixado. Então é muito fácil e muito simples de apoiar. É graças a essas pessoas incríveis que eu posso estar trazendo conteúdo para vocês. E é isso aí, pessoal. Não se esqueçam de deixar seu like, seu comentário e até mais. Fui! Grande abraço.